Let's talk about the unsung hero of your kitchen. It's this invisible force that gives our absolute favorite foods their amazing texture. From a silky smooth sauce to a perfectly crispy crust. Well, that's all thanks to starch, the secret ingredient that's really doing all the heavy lifting.
But have you ever stopped to wonder about this? I mean, how can the exact same ingredient, flour, which is mostly just starch, do two completely different things? One minute, you're using it to create this thick, luscious gravy, and the next, it's forming a golden brown, totally delicious crust on a loaf of bread. It feels like it shouldn't be possible, right? But it's all down to some really cool science. So, to figure out the mystery of flour's double life, we've got to start at the beginning. We need to ask, what even is starch? What are we really talking about here?
Okay, so on a basic level, starch is just how plants, like wheat, corn, or potatoes, store up their energy. It's basically a bunch of glucose units all chained together and packed into these tiny little granules. And here's a key thing to remember. These granules don't dissolve in cold water. That's why you can mix cornstarch into cold water and get that milky slurry. It hasn't actually done anything yet.
Now, things get interesting when we look inside those little granules. Because in there, we've got a cast of two main characters. And the way they interact pretty much defines everything that happens next in our cooking. So let's meet our two key players, amylose and amylopectin. The huge difference between these two is their shape. Amylose is a long, straight, simple chain, kind of like a piece of string. This simple structure is perfect for linking up with other amylose strings to form a really strong web, which is why it's so great at forming gels. Amylopectin, on the other hand, is big, bushy, and has branches going everywhere. It's not so good at linking up, but its massive, clunky shape is perfect for just getting in the way and thickening liquid. And in most of the starches we use, it's the thickener. Amylopectin, that's the main event. It usually makes up about 70 to 80% of the starch. And that's why we mostly think of starch as a thickener. But that other 20 to 30% of amylose, it's incredibly important, as we're about to see. So how does starch actually do its thickening magic? Well, this brings us to its first big transformation. It's what happens when starch meets water and heat, and it's the science behind every great soup, sauce, and gravy you've ever had. It's a process called gelatinization. Gelatinization. This is that awesome moment when a watery liquid just transforms into a thick, beautiful paste. When you heat those starch granules in water, they start to soak it all up and swell. And here's the kicker. This change is irreversible. You can't unthicken your gravy and turn it back into a watery mess. Let's break that down. First, the granules just absorb water. Then you add heat, and they start to swell up like millions of tiny sponges. As they get bigger, their structure loosens up, and those little straight-chain amylose molecules, the strings, start to leak out into the water. Finally, you get this combination of swollen, crowded granules and all this escaped amylose floating around, creating a massive molecular traffic jam. And that traffic jam is what we feel as a thick, viscous paste. But wait, thickening is only part of the story. The process actually keeps going even after we turn the stove off. And that brings us to the next phase, the journey from a paste into a full-on gel. This is called gelation. Gelation is really the science of setting. It's what happens when you take your hot, thick vanilla pudding, put it in the fridge to cool, and it turns into a firm, spoonable dessert. And this whole process, it relies almost completely on that amylose, those little strings that leaked out earlier. So as that hot mixture starts to cool down, all those string-like amylose molecules, they lose energy and they start to link up with each other. They form this huge, three-dimensional, microscopic net. And this net traps all the water molecules, holding them in place and giving the whole thing that semi-solid, wobbly, gel-like structure we know and love. Now, every good story needs a villain, right? Over time, that beautiful gel structure we just made can start to change, and, well, not always for the better. This brings us to the science of staling, a process called retrogradation. Retrogradation is basically the starch molecules trying to go back home, back to their original, tightly packed, uncooked state. The long chains of both amylose and amylopectin slowly start to squeeze back together, realigning themselves into these ordered, crystalline shapes. It's a really slow process, but it has some very noticeable effects. So what does this actually look like in our kitchen? Well, it's why your leftover pudding gets a bit tough and rubbery, and most famously, it is the reason bread goes stale. And here's a pro tip. Retrogradation happens way faster at cold temperatures, which is exactly why you should never, ever store your bread in the fridge. It also leads to this other weird thing called syneresis.
Syneresis is just the fancy scientific name for a gel weeping. You've seen this before. As that starch network from retrogradation tightens up and gets more crystalline, it literally squeezes the water it was holding right out. That's why you sometimes find that puddle of water on top of leftover gravy or yogurt. That's syneresis right there.
Okay, so we've talked all about wet heat, cooling, and even staling, but that only answers half of our original question, right? What about the browning? To understand that, we have to completely forget about water and enter the world of dry heat. This is the art of dextrinization. The rules for this are totally different. We're not talking about hydration or swelling anymore. Dextrinization needs two things: really high temperatures and very little, if any, moisture. So think toasting, baking, or frying. Under that intense dry heat, the long chains of starch literally get blasted apart into smaller pieces called dextrins. This chemical breakdown completely changes how the starch tastes and looks. It develops a sweeter, nuttier, more toasted flavor, and of course, that gorgeous golden brown color. This is the science behind the crust on your toast, the browning on a tortilla, and the deep, delicious flavor in a roux. So there you have it, the 4 major transformations of starch. But, knowing the science is one thing. Actually using it is something else entirely. So the real question is, how do you, as the cook, take control of all these reactions? Well, this is where your other ingredients come into play. Take sugar, for example. It competes with the starch for water, which means you'll need a higher temperature to get things to thicken, and you'll end up with a softer gel. Acid, like lemon juice or vinegar, can actually start to chop up the starch molecules, which will give you a thinner sauce or a weaker gel. And fat? Fat coats the starch granules, slowing down thickening, but often giving you a much smoother, richer final texture. All right, let's do a quick recap of this whole journey. With wet heat, starch gelatinizes and thickens. When it cools, it goes through gelation and sets. Over time in storage, it retrogrades and goes stale. And with dry heat, it dextrinizes, creating that beautiful color and amazing flavor. 4 totally different processes, all from the very same ingredient. And that really gets to the core of it, doesn't it? Understanding these changes is absolutely crucial. This isn't just some abstract science experiment. It's the key to controlling how your food tastes, how it feels in your mouth, and how long it's going to last. So now you know the fundamental rules. You know how starch behaves. You know why a sauce thickens, why a pudding sets, why bread gets stale, and why your toast gets brown. So the real question is, what are you going to do with this new superpower the next time you step into your kitchen?